All right. Good morning, everyone. Wow.
I heard Rebecca. That was the only one I heard.
So unusual.
Say it again.
No, I'm not gonna.
Oh, man. I don't repeat myself.
Good morning, Mike.
Hi, Jamie. Very good to see you. Hey, if you're sitting over there, how are we supposed to use your microphone?
I don't think you want me to use my microphone today.
Well, it's very good to see everyone, and thankful that you're here as we're moving further in our John study. We're in John 18, picking up in verse 10 with the betrayal of Jesus in the garden. Judas and the soldiers with the Roman army and with the temple guard being sent by the priest have showed up at the garden, and they are confronting Jesus and the disciples. And we ended last week, verses 7 through 9. Then asked he them again, Whom seek ye? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I have told you that I am. If therefore ye seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spake, Of them which thou gavest me, I have lost none. We made mention on how that the I am statements before the crowd were a connection to his deity, and that he is taking upon himself the very identity and name, if you will, of God from the Old Testament, when Moses was in conversation with God through the burning bush and preparing him to go back and to take Israel out of Egypt, which is a very fitting comparison, because with Israel being in Egypt and bondage to that class of people, you have that working as a symbolism of man's bondage to sin and God's deliverance for them and their redemption out of that. The whole Passover scenario in connection with that event, and now being placed here at this time frame with Jesus and his crucifixion that's upcoming, how all of that's fitting into the Passover week, and that here is God once again striving to pass over sin if is at all possible. And what makes that possible, or what made that possible under the Old Testament system, was the shedding of the blood of the Lamb and putting that on the doorpost and the center post across the top. Now we will have God being involved in passing over the sins of man through the blood of the Lamb, and that being of the sacrifice of his Son. And we made mention from verse 8 last week, again, if therefore you seek me, let these go their way. Here's Christ, and he's putting himself between his followers and trouble and danger. He is at this time intervening for them, petitioning for their freedom. Take me, let them go. And that's going to be the whole situation of what he's about to go through with the crucifixion. He is putting himself in between all of us and the punishment that is deserving of us in the transgressions that are committed, sins that we commit, and the consequences of that. But then in verse 10, we have the situation with Peter. And Peter is going to become a focal point throughout this chapter alongside of Jesus and what he's going through. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, smote the high priest's servant, cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So John gives us a full record of the event. Which apostle did it, which ear was cut off, and even down to the name of the victim.
John likes calling people out. And
Yeah,
it's
for sure.
primarily Peter that he calls out.
For sure. I mean, and even once we get past the crucifixion and we get to the resurrection and they're racing to the tomb, John's got to throw himself in there that he beat Peter there. So yeah, it's pretty interesting, and it's humorous. It's pretty comical that this is going on. But when we're thinking about this situation, and that we have Peter being called out on the carpet, and once again, we have the impulsive nature on the part of Peter. But is this just a Peter problem or just Peter working off of impulse? Now that's an important question because, we're honing in on Peter at this stage because he's the one being mentioned. But if you tie in the other accounts, what do you think you're going to find?
But they were all
Okay.
set on edge.
In Luke 22, starting in 47, while he yet spake, behold, a multitude, and he that was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them, and drew near unto Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said unto him, Judas, betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss? And then notice verse 49. When they, which were about him, saw what would follow, they said unto him, Lord, shall we smite with the sword? That's plural. This wasn't just a Peter thing. They were all having this thought. Now, Peter was the one that acted, but we have once again a scenario similar to that back in John 12. So in John 12, you have the breaking of the alabaster box and the pouring out of the ointment on Jesus' feet. And we have recorded for us how in John 12, Judas says, why this waste when this could have been sold for, I think, 300 pence and given to the poor. Okay? But what do you remember from us talking about that and going to the other gospel accounts?
Weren't they all upset?
Yeah. So it wasn't just a Judas thing. It started with Judas, but it started spreading amongst the group to where they actually started saying it. So that's where, as we are going through this time together, it's this is again another point of making sure that we're taking all of this and bringing it into a proper picture. There's nothing wrong with how John records it. Peter was the one that smote the ear. But where we get ourselves into troubles, we would take John's record and we just say, oh, well, Peter's the one called out. Peter's the one that did it. He's the only one with this problem. Nope. Luke records for us this was running wild throughout the group. And it's understandable. Let me see, where is it? Okay, so it's coming here in a moment. We'll tie in some more from Luke's account on why it is the case that they would even be thinking this way. Why Peter would even be ready to take such an action. So here we have these two situations. On one side, you have Judas walking with Christ, but now he's on the side of the enemy. And now we have Peter on the side with Christ. And yet Jesus gives no rebuke to Judas. In fact, he calls Judas friend, Matthew 26 and verse 50. Here's Peter not just standing with Christ, but he stood ready to defend the Christ. And yet Peter faces a correction. Similar to that of Matthew chapter 16, where Jesus has already rebuked Peter for talking in such a fashion, but now Peter's talk has turned into action. Why do you think it is that Jesus would call Judas friend, but then tell Peter hey, you don't need to do this?
My mind goes to the two different hearts because Judas is doing this to betray Jesus. He has the understanding that I'm doing this, and then Peter's trying to do something that's right in his own mind, so he stands up to protect Jesus, and then Jesus is going, well, hold on, you're acting too fast. This isn't the time, so you back down. And so Judas is different area with his mind and his heart to where
Okay.
he's
All
actually
right.
betraying him.
All right.
And also, if he's calling Judas friend right there, in a way that's still appealing to him, just like we talked about last week, with everybody that he's talking to. He's still appealing to them. He still loves his soul. And if he can get through, although he already knows, but Judas has free choice.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. Anybody else? And I'm not looking for any right answer. I'm just trying to generate thought here.
But you're all wrong.
Yeah.
That's it.
It's not what I want, or it's not what I'm looking for, but we're just, like, as we're going through this, your gears have got to be going on this stuff. And you got to be able to pinpoint and just kind of focus in on this exchange and dialogue. Yeah, why did Jesus call Judas friend, but yet tells Peter, put away your sword. One that lives by the sword is going to die by the sword. Why didn't he give some kind of statement like that to Judas, who's actually doing something that we would view as being, it's not even in the situation of us just viewing it, wicked and evil to betray the Son of God?
Just kind of along Reese's thought, to where Judas had hardened his heart and wouldn't receive any correction or instruction anymore, but Peter is still able to learn and grow.
Okay.
If you got arrested, you wouldn't be able to further the church with Peter.
Okay.
Well, and then we know the force, we know what's going to happen. Judas does express remorse. He is. So there is still a little bit there because he does, he tries to give the money back after he realizes what was truly done
Yep.
later.
Okay.
So there's,
Now, along with it, I know Jesus doesn't rebuke him, but he does question him. Why are you doing this?
Right.
Like you said last week, like that.
You'll betray me with a kiss? Yeah.
Yeah, that gut. Ugh. Like Jesus is, even here, Jesus is still correcting, but in his own way. It's like, why would you do this?
Yeah.
And then that guilt goes over Judas. So it's not a correcting as in, hey, don't do this, but it's, I'm getting you to think.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So when we're considering this, it does come down to there is a difference in their actions, which boils down to the point that Reese was making about
I was right.
a difference in motivation and where their minds are. So when we're thinking about Peter is acting impulsively, fearful, angry, even. And I would even argue that it's a situation of where we would categorize it as just seeing red, and you see red and you're just not even thinking. Whereas, so it's a heat of the moment situation, whereas with Judas, what he did was premeditated, willful, deliberate, what the Old Testament would describe as presumptuous. So Peter ends up being a really good illustration of what Paul wrote about in Romans chapter 10 and verse 2. For I bear them record that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge. There's the desire to want to do something, but you're not thinking. And so it's a situation of, like I said, tacking it back to Matthew 16, where you already have Jesus confronting Peter on his speech. And in that situation, where Jesus is saying, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, be betrayed, and I'm going to die, Peter says, "Be it far from thee, Lord." And that's where Jesus says what to Peter?
Get thee behind me.
What?
Satan.
Satan. Okay. There's the kick. Get thee behind me, Satan. Thou desirest not the things of God. Peter's thinking fleshly. You're not thinking spiritually, thinking heavenly. You're thinking carnally. And as we said, those thoughts turn into speech, and now speech turns into action. And that it's a situation like throughout all this time and throughout all this teaching, okay, Peter, you should have been picking up on the fact of this, like this is going to happen. There's not anything you can do to stop this. And if your mind is set on the things of God and you're minding what his mind is, then you'll be ready to recognize this.
The other thing is too, it's just a few hours before, or even maybe not even that much, Jesus told them someone's going to betray.
Right.
And so they were told that, but just seeing it face to face with all of the soldiers and everything, and just the fact that Judas was among them just a few hours before and did this. Just
Yep.
and like you say, it led to his presumptuous, not him, but just his lack of self-control.
Yeah.
And thinking fleshly.
And that's a good point for something that we'll end up connecting with later. Go ahead, Jordan.
Also going along with what you are saying with the thinking physically, not spiritually, it goes back to the walking on water.
Yeah.
Not just the walking on water, sorry, when he's sleeping.
Yeah.
Where he's like, really, guys? And then he goes, he commands, so he's like, don't you know this? So going to the Matthew part where right after he says, those who take up the sword will perish by the sword. Then he goes, don't you know I could bring 12 legions of
Yep.
angels?
Yep.
And then he says, the scriptures, how then will the scriptures be fulfilled which say that this must happen this way? Like, Peter,
Yeah.
think spiritually. Don't you know who I am yet? Which he does.
Yeah.
So it's just going along with what you're saying.
And it goes into that meekness element. Meekness is strength under control. All right, Peter, it's evident you have the zeal. And I'm just, okay, we have him cutting off an ear, but do we really think he was aiming for the ear?
Nope.
No.
You got the head.
If anything, he would have been aiming more middle. And just even in that aspect, being able to draw your sword ready to take another man's life. Now, we got some folks in here that conceal carry.
No, we don't.
How ready are you to pull that out and
Depending on the situation.
take a life?
I'm ready.
Now, you say that, Peter.
It depends on the situation, just like the fox. It's like, okay, what's going on? Yeah, I can do it.
I would say, like Peter, we really don't know till we're in the situation. But even for Peter to have that gumption says a lot about his zeal. But it goes back to the knowledge part. Okay, Peter, you should be recognizing what's at play here. And that's the danger that goes with acting in such a way, and why you would have this being stated to Peter like this, why he's being corrected, called out in this situation. Because you're walking on dangerous ground here. And just like what Maddie said, that would be a prime place for Peter to get arrested alongside with Jesus. As Jesus is trying to say, Jesus, let them go, then Peter does something dumb like this. And it's like, well, now our hands are tied. We got to take you in. You just assaulted an officer. And then you wouldn't have Peter in the position, Pope, that he would be in to help get the church up and going.
Something to think about too is we're thinking, when they come in to get Jesus, that there's only a few people in there.
Yeah.
But last week we went over how many men was there?
600?
Yeah, 600 Romans, right?
Yeah, banned. Yeah.
So there's 600, and you're going after one guy. And there's only 12 of you
Yeah.
against 600 plus. Just what are you thinking?
Yeah.
gotta read the situation.
Right. Now you just, I mean, again, but even still, putting ourselves in the position of Peter and where his mind would be going. I mean, you just consider back in Luke 22:38. So here we are in Luke's account. Yeah, Luke 22:47 is where Judas shows up. And in Luke 22:38, what conversation, or what was the conversation that Jesus was having with the apostles?
What chapter?
Luke 22 and verse 38.
Go get yourself a sword. Well, we have 2 swords. That's enough.
Okay, we just had a conversation about swords.
Isn't this timeless?
Yeah, exactly. So here we are. Jesus just said, well, Peter just said, I've got 2. Okay, that's enough. Well, Peter's got his, and he's going to start whacking away. But it's not the time for that. That's going to come later.
On the day of Pentecost.
Right, exactly.
You're not perceiving.
Exactly. You're not piecing this together. You're not understanding. You're not comprehending. Which, by the way, if you want a good tool to be able to remember the sword conversation, just think calibers. 22:38. There's your weapon. There's your weapon chapter.
And a doctor that wrote it.
Right. Here's a good illustration, a good place to establish for us how zeal without knowledge creates problems. We need to be careful about our actions. And this zeal without knowledge can create problems and hurt that only Jesus is going to be able to heal. Cut off an ear. All right, that's a situation during this time frame. You're not getting that back. That's just gone. But Christ is there, and he's able to put it back together. And just how often in our zeal do we, or have we seen situations where that zeal causes hurt that have to be healed, and that because of actions that were brought out without knowledge. So our knowledge needs to keep up with our zeal. And usually, that's a scenario, a situation where young people have the tendency of getting themselves in trouble. Okay, they got a lot of zeal, but they don't have so much knowledge to go along with it. But then, the opposite is usually the problem and trouble for the older crowd, where you end up you have a good storage of knowledge, but your zeal ends up lacking. Both are a problem. So both of these need to be held together and striving to hold them at the same level. So any thoughts on that before we move to verse 11?
I had thought about the broadcast that you used to be involved in. I would recommend that when you watch the zeal in that, and you would see the zeal, the people afterwards that you would talk to, like a couple people that I know and I've talked to, that, and even when you read the comments of the people following them, that it is just, we've got this persona or person that I'm watching, and you just watch that all the time. So it's like, okay, we can just go in chopping heads, but not understanding the Bible. And you kind of talk the same way when you went to a certain place to go learn that you can no longer recommend.
Yeah.
You've gone to a lot of places that you can't recommend it anymore. When you went there, you even went in saying, well, I knew how to debate, but I didn't quite have full biblical knowledge, So with all that in mind, that needs to be
Yeah.
It's not about debating, and that sometimes is the attitude. Oh, I can out debate you. It's like no, it's to win a soul.
Yeah.
And if you can do it with debating and knowledge and facts, that's what we would hope for. But it's not just about well, I just won. Because
Right.
then that's when the fingers that are getting pointed at us are true, that we are being what people think we are, which we're not.
Yeah.
I think I made sense, but I don't know. You have the zeal.
Yeah, there something was thinking about adding on to that, but I don't think that I will because it'll do well to stand on its own. But there again, I mean, that's what we're trying to do here in bringing this into application for situations that we're in. Okay, none of us are going to find ourselves in this kind of situation again. But even though we'll never be in this exact situation, the circumstances and the event itself still finds application throughout what we're going to face today. So it's just making sure that, all right, do I have the zeal to do this? Yes. Well, then I need to go out and practice it with the proper knowledge and wisdom. So it's what Jesus presented to the apostles, and they're going out and dealing with false prophets. Wise as serpents, but harmless as doves. All right, that's zeal with knowledge. So then Jesus said unto Peter, put up thy sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? A few things here that we need to break down in consideration. Put up thy sword into the sheath. While Peter is desiring to stand up and to defend his master, this is not the way that he's needing Peter to defend him. And that ties back into our John 14 discussion with the advocate. Okay, Peter, you will be given an opportunity to defend me, but it won't be by force. But the defense that Peter is needing to give is that in the courts and by the sharing of the gospel. So put away this physical weapon of war, put it back into the sheath. Then the mention of the cup. Here we have, throughout Jesus' teaching and dealing with his apostles, he's made mention and connection in this fashion with the suffering that he was going to go through, and that too referencing of, well, here's this cup of suffering. Now, this helps us on a few different levels. I can't remember the literary term that this is. So it's when we go through our studies and we're reading these different things, we make mention of terms like synecdoche, and there's synecdoche. There's metonymy, which I can't remember the definition of that one either.
There's inclusio.
Okay, yeah, there's inclusio. You go back into the Old Testament, back in Genesis chapter 1, and there's what's the literary term there? You can tell this is not something that I have in my notes. It's just something that's hitting me in the moment.
And you're the
I have it. So like, for example, Genesis 2 and verse 3, you have prolipsis that's used. And that's a literary term or literary tool that's used to join together in one statement two events that are widely separate in time. Genesis 2:3 to Genesis 3:20. You have personification, for that matter, where inanimate objects are said to be doing things that we as humans would be doing. The stones that cry out and different things like that. So with this, in referencing to the cup, and I'll go back and try to find the actual term that I'm looking for. When Jesus uses this kind of language in referencing to the cup, what is he actually talking about?
His suffering.
All right, he's talking about his suffering. So then he's not, in fact, referencing to the vessel, but he's referencing what is found inside of the vessel. Okay? Okay.
His purpose.
Okay. So then, with that connection being made, how can that also help us in another section?
The anti.
Yeah, you're talking about the one cuppers.
Okay,
It's not even about the cup.
that's right.
We can just eat a grape.
Well, you couldn't eat it. But that's how you answer those of our brethren that would try to say, well, no. Jesus said, drink of this cup. So you got to have the one cup and everybody's got to drink from it, which I think it's Luke's record actually says. He tells them, divide this amongst yourselves. So they're not even taking that into consideration. But when he's referencing there about the cup, what's the focus? What's he actually talking about?
His suffering.
Huh?
His suffering here.
Here's his suffering,
Okay.
but in that context
Okay.
of establishing the Lord's Supper and telling them, drink of this cup, the fruit of the vine, he's talking about what's inside of the cup, not the vessel. So that's where, again, our brains have to start generating and start working, like, okay, what cup? What are we talking about here? Oh, he's talking about his suffering. It's not a literal cup. It's not a reference to the vessel. It's about what's in it.
So it's not 12 legions of angels?
Well, and he had just prayed in the garden in another version of the gospel. If this, cup,
Right.
let this cup pass.
Pass from me.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then also, would it be the same lingo where you say, can you take the baptism when James and John?
Right, the baptism, which, yeah, I'll be baptized with. You're going to, yep,
We're not talking about baptism, we're talking about the
Suffering.
the everything that's coming with it.
yep. He's going to be buried.
So you're saying this is another term than synecdoche?
I don't think synecdoche is the right term. But, like I said, I'll have to go back and find the actual term.
That is what you're saying, you think it's a different summarization.
Sure, yeah.
Summarizing.
A summarization could possibly work. Okay, now having dealt with that, so here's this thing that Christ is about to endure. He's already been talking to his apostles about it. Look, this is happening. And now he's having to enforce it on Peter even more. The cup, but then notice this, which my Father hath given me. What's the significance in that?
He's doing his Father's will.
Okay, doing the Father's will.
Maddie said his purpose.
Okay, this is his purpose. What about the fact of it being given? Huh? Right, it's a gift. But if I give you something, is it being forced on you? Do you have to take it?
No,
No.
Willful.
he's doing it willfully.
This is a willful receiving.
So he is separate from the Father. So with the one in the Godhead, he's being given this thing and he is taking it on.
Oh, well, there's that, yeah. But here we have the reality that this is not forced. Much like what our Calvinist friends would say, oh, well, God's just so sovereign that he's got to have his way. Even in this situation between the relationship of father and son, Jesus references this as this is something that's being handed out. And he's got a choice in the matter. It's as if the Father is passing it over and allowing him to take it. Or to not. And that his mission was to drink of that cup, to endure that suffering, and that for the salvation of mankind. And even for him to ask the question, shall I not drink it? In connection with this statement, the cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? Am I really going to refuse this? Knowing that this is the Father's will, and knowing that he's given it over to me to do. And I'm going to turn my back on that? No. It's not possible. Go ahead, Jamie.
Nothing. The only thing I would have brought up is he's already talked about, he didn't come for his own purpose, and he is doing the Father's will, and he's already made those statements before when he's talking to them earlier in the night.
Yep.
And so this is, of course not. And then he's already promised that this is pretty much a done deal
Right.
because of God's and him, his godliness.
Yep. And again, this, attaches itself back into Matthew 16, like we stated. Who is thinking, whose mind is on heavenly things? And right here, Jesus is trying to get Peter on the same vein. Look, this is not just happening by happenstance. This is all in accordance with the will of the Father, and he's given me this to do. Am I not going to do it? And here's Peter trying to do everything that he can at this point to stop this ball from rolling. And so again, all that ties into our discussion with John 13, 14, 15, 16, and where Jesus is trying to impress upon their minds even further on just how it's necessary, it's essential that I go.
I would just make a comment, and this is just a human comment, but here's Peter in the moment. He's been told this is happening. It's happening, but the horror of the fact that it's happening,
Yeah.
and there's nothing to stop it, and even though he's been told by Jesus, this is my job, I'm going to do it, but just in the moment, and for us, the application for us, when we see it and we're questioning, is this really happening? And how we handle that and with our own self-control, like, no, and trying to recognize, like I said to you a few weeks ago, sometimes it's hard to see the forest through the trees in our own suffering or what's going on in our own life, and you just, is this really it?
Right. And then verse 12. Even with everything that's just transpired, then the band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him. He's already surrendered. And he's not hiding his identity. There's no resistance. And yet they still found it necessary to cuff him. And then, to consider the other side of it, he let them do it. He goes ahead and he lets them bind him up. And it's a realization and understanding of the fact of, or it's in connection with what he's just previously said. All right, bind me, but let these other ones go. And that his love for them, his love for us, allowed them to do this. It was for our sins that he let them take him in. And even to go through with this show of force. That's what you guys were talking about earlier on, about the band of Roman soldiers. Close to 600 men for this one guy and 12 of his followers. You're really needing this kind of force to go out for this small crowd. Well, yeah, if we're wanting to send a message. And a lot of times that's what people will do. None of this is necessary. But even still, as we said, you just had a man's ear cut off, and Jesus picks it up and puts it back on his head. And you still find it necessary to bind him? I mean, number one, that you would take him in to custody at all. But then number two, he's got this kind of power, and you think chains are going to hold him? Just how foolish we can be sometimes. And then verse 13, we have quote unquote the trial beginning, if you will. They bound him and led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. I believe we took the time in our Matthew study and broke down different sections as to why all of this situation was illegal in the trial. And here's an extra layer to that. Caiaphas is the high priest. But they took him to Annas first. That's an illegal move. Annas is not even the high priest. You shouldn't even be taking him to see this man. You should be taking him to Caiaphas. He's the one in charge. But we have been shown to us how deep the corruption is inside of the Jewish system at this time. So you take him to Annas, and you take him to Annas because he's the father-in-law to Caiaphas. And the historical records let us know that Annas, and he had about five sons that are involved in taking this position, and they're just swapping it out amongst themselves. So there you have a situation where even though Caiaphas is quote unquote the high priest, who's really pulling the strings? Who's really in charge? Well, you can tell by who they take him to first. It's a similar situation of what the Romans had set up in Israel at this time, where you have Herod being the governor. But who's really in charge? Rome is in charge. And they did that under the Old Testament system too. The Assyrians would come in, or the Assyrians came in, but they set up a puppet regime with a king that they knew would listen to them. And the Babylonians did the same thing. Well, now we have that exact thing going on inside of the priesthood. This shows how this holy position was now just a tool of politics. And that it fits right back into the discussion that they were having. I think it's around the John 6 mark, or John 6 time frame, where they are conspiring to get rid of Jesus, because if we don't, the Romans are going to come in and take us out of our spot, take us out of our place of power. Well, Annas has set himself up to where he's able to stay in power the whole entire time. And this is an important factor for us to consider because we've already gone through our study and pointed out the importance of priesthood in religion and in the redemption of man. And that at the heart of religion is the priest. So then we have also, just again, further contrast for us to be able to view and to study. Just look at the difference between Annas, Caiaphas, and our high priest. That we have Jesus. And we're being shown also what happens when a priesthood is abused. Religion crumbles. There is no justice. There really is no hope of that if the priesthood itself ends up being corrupted like this. What you got, Jamie?
I'm just thinking of the words in, when God is talking about he's tired of the blood of bulls and goats, and he's just tired of their system, and he's promising the new system. I mean, the system was already promised from the beginning, but just to know that these evil people are the ones who have to go in and sacrifice for their own sins and their family first, and then sacrifice for Israel, and they're just icky.
Yeah. Matthew 23, they make white, they cleanse the outside of the cups, but the inside still filthy. White as sepulchres, full of dead men's bones. This is what he's talking about. And then, so as we're considering this, breaking this down even further, not only do we have this as a contrast between this high priest with our high priest, but then just thinking about the priesthood in general, breaking it down to your normal priest, if you don't mind me labeling that way, then that brings it into our realm. That ends up setting all of this at our doorstep, because what are we under the New Testament system? We're all priests. 1 Peter 2, 5, and 8 through 9. Christians are a royal priesthood. All right. What if we abuse this office? What if we allow ourselves to become corrupted, just like them? Christianity crumbles. It's ruined. So why is it that we're seeing the failure of so many congregations? There's a failure within the priesthood. And especially when it comes to the elements of holiness and purity, sanctification that we talked about. We're reading right here about what happens when priesthood is abused. When it becomes a tool of correction for everybody else, but not for me. So any thoughts on that?
Well, this is just kind of off topic a little bit, but it makes you wonder, as all of this political machinations are going on right here, where's Paul in all of this?
Ah.
He's kept his zeal for God, but is he unaware of this corruption? I mean, how does he live within this and call himself a Pharisee of the Pharisees?
Right.
So it's just kind of interesting to think that.
I would argue that Saul he knows what's going on. He would have been one of the ones on the inner circle. And I would argue that a lot of this is going to be part of the kicking against the pricks that Jesus calls him out on the road to Damascus in Acts chapter 9. He would have known about all of this. He would have known all of this was illegal, sinful, in the sight of God. And as you're saying, it's a situation even with Saul where he's just having to work this stuff out. Not necessarily that he's having to work this out. I mean, this is clearly wrong on all matters of the law. But then just trying to weigh it out to where it's just, okay, we're dealing with somebody who is, in his mind, in Saul's mind, an enemy to God and a perverter of God's system. Well, okay, I can kind of understand in that situation, we're just trying to do whatever we can to get rid of this guy. But that still doesn't give you the right and the liberty to break God's law. So I would argue that a lot of this would have been weighing on him, and even with the killing of Stephen. He knew that wasn't right, according to the law. He hadn't done anything wrong, worthy of death, and yet they did it. But it's all coming back, to the heart of the individual. It's clear that he was battling with it. He wasn't just going along with it. But there again, it's just another situation where we would look at this from our vantage point and just say, yeah, this is gross and disgusting, and I never would be a part of such a thing. There's stuff like this that goes on in the church all the time. Politics like this, nepotism involved in the church, putting people in positions of leadership and they're not really leading, and all of that just for securing a power, securing a position. All right, any other thoughts?
I think there's two categories to what you're talking about with the priesthood getting corrupted. There's the older crowd that should know better. They have the knowledge. Talking, let's just go big with the GBN type people, to where, okay, you older generations know things, but then you're the ones that are failing and getting lazy and not teaching right and allowing the nepotism and the whatever. But then the young people don't know, to where we're talking about the tent meeting and how, okay, well, in order to even care about what God hates, you have to know about God, and you have to want to know about God. Why do I want to know about God? So, okay, if you don't have the knowledge, you can't then perform. You're just going through the motions of the Elks Club or the whatever. And you're just going through this thing. So, I mean, one of the biggest eye-opening things for me was with modesty, the argument that David Sproul brings up is, well, why did they even have to get dressed? After God, it's only God and husband and wife there. Why? Why do they need to get dressed? Well, it's because it's what God wants. God set this desire. It's like, well, you're not making anybody else less there. It's only these two. And, you're only naked before God, who can see everything. He knows everything. So what's the point? Well, the point is doing what God says, because he set the boundary. So then going back to the point that I have, you've got this class of people that have the knowledge. They can teach. They know how to study the Bible. But they're in it like the Pharisees. But then you have the younger crowd, which I would include myself in, that I don't have the knowledge and I don't know the why behind them doing anything. Which is why this is important to what we're doing. That we're not just going, well, we've been in the church this whole time, and I'm a part of the church, and I've been baptized, and blah, 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 and all that, to where it's like, no, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
Because I was asked that by an atheist exchange student, why are you a Christian? And I was like, well, my answer was, because it's faith. But it's like, the more I keep posting that guy that's been doing creation versus evolution, and I'm like, listening to all this stuff, that now I'm hearing facts against evolution that I've never known, to where I'm saying with the priesthood, not all of them know about the holiness. We're learning about, wait, there's only supposed to be one high priest. If you're not told that, you just go, okay, you don't understand. So that's the problem that we're in, is the younger crowd just like, well, Grandpa was Church of Christ, so we're Church of Christ, but I don't know why. So,
How come you're saying that with a southern accent?
because that's where Church of Christ started, was over there.
Yeah, it started back east with Alexander Campbell.
Back to you, Mike.
Okay. And so again, this is the same Caiaphas from John 11. They made the prophetic statement. 51, 52, this spake he not of himself, being high priest that year. He prophesied that Jesus should die for that nation, and not for that nation only. This is a sub-point that John throws in by inspiration. Not for that nation only, but that also he should gather together in one the children of God that were scattered abroad. And this connects to Genesis 49:10, the promise being made to Judah, and the establishment of a kingdom with him, throne with him, the scepter shall not depart from him until the gathering of the people should take place. Attaching over to Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 10, that in the dispensation of the fullness of times, he, Christ, might gather together in one all things in Christ. So this is not just a Jewish matter. This is a universal matter. This is every people, every group that's coming in. Jesus has been bound. Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door without. Then went out that other disciple, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. As we've been going through our studies, we've been pointing out the different sections where we are finding problems with the apostles, and especially when it comes to their understanding of things. And here again, we're carrying further with that Peter's action in the garden, now where he's fixing to find himself and being in the palace of the high priest. John 13, Peter states that he wanted to go with Jesus. And even says, I'm willing to die with you if necessary. Now just place yourself here, put yourself here. And just imagine the confusion and the chaos. And the other apostles, they've split. It's exactly what Jesus said. The shepherd has been smitten, the sheep have scattered. But here we have Peter and another disciple alone. Now, many think that this other disciple was John, but I don't know necessarily that I'm able to go there with people. And I would argue that the points that they would try to bring out in trying to state that this was John doesn't necessarily hold water. Now, the biggest reason as to why I do not think that this is John is because Jesus has already said, well, I want these to go away. And in a moment, the high priest is going to question Jesus about his disciples. Now, if you were involved in a conspiracy, in a plot to try to take the head honcho into custody so as to have him die, are you going to bring in someone that you know is one of his cohorts and co-conspirators?
Well, if you can. Well, to cut out the leadership, if you're asking, that's what you would think.
Potentially. But even in the situation of Peter, do they know right away that Peter's a disciple? No, there's going to be an interrogation that ends up taking place. So in those situations alone, the very fact like you're saying, okay, yeah, possibly letting them in because, well, we're wanting to gather everybody up, and here they are coming in, so let's just gather them up. Well, Peter's going in such a way to where people are not recognizing him as being a disciple. And even in this situation, where this is a disciple that's known unto the high priest, well, if that's John, they're going to know he's an apostle. Well, we're not letting you in here. Because the last thing they're wanting is somebody in defense
Chopping ears.
for the accused. We don't want anybody in here causing trouble. Second, we don't want anybody that can actually be a witness on his behalf. This isn't John. And we know that there are plenty of other disciples running around Jerusalem at this time. I mean, Matthew 27, you have Joseph of Arimathea, who gives him his tomb, takes his body. He's labeled as a disciple.
It's kind of sad he's not named. He was brave.
True. Certainly.
We're not named.
Yeah. And that's another good point. I mean, here we have just this no-name disciple.
It was Matthew. He was the tax.
Yeah. This no-name disciple, and he's pulling strings so as to, get Peter in. So with Peter, excuse me. So here's Peter, and he's having this desire to stick with Jesus and follow with him. Now, on one hand, that is admirable. But then you also have to think about it from the other hand. Wouldn't it have been better for Peter if he had not gotten in?
That's a trick question.
Kind of, sort of.
Because you grow from what happened.
Huh?
You grow from what happened.
All right, don't get ahead of me.
You would Keep going.
But no, that's it. On one hand, we would look at this situation from what we know is fixing to take place, even what Jesus warned Peter about. You're going to deny me 3 times.
No, I'm not.
Well, okay, then I'm just going to,
Deny what?
right, I'm going to deny him once, or no, I would never do that. Well, knowing that this is going to happen some way, somehow, I'm just going to hide myself away somewhere, and just avoid that situation altogether. I can see that, but then going to the point that Jordan made, if he hadn't put himself in this situation, then he's not going to be able to learn from his failure, and we wouldn't be able to learn from it either. So then saith the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, Art not thou also one of this man's disciples? He saith, I am not. And the servants and officers stood there, who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. So now when we're reading this, and we're seeing this first denial on the part of Peter, what emotions or thoughts are brought up about Peter in this situation?
Kind of my thought process on it would be you're trying to stay there and see what happens, so you're trying to be sneaky, but he's just up front lying, and he's not really being sneaky. It's just no, I'm not.
Yeah.
But you're still trying to get in there and see like what's going on, but then so that they don't take you as well. So it's this big old thing. It's like I don't know. It's kind of where my mind was going. So.
Well, the whole thing is, okay, well, the Jewish way is the way, but yet I'm following this Christ, but then now the Jews are saying, no, my family's religion, my whole life, they're all taken away, the Romans, how many Romans, this whole thing's happening. It's like, well, what's going to happen to Jesus? I was following, and okay, well, I kind of want to know what's going on. And you go in, it's like, well, I don't really want to be tortured now. Your adrenaline dump's happening. You're in there, and like, well, I just want to know what's going to happen to Jesus. don't know what to even say because the Jews and Jesus, that whole confusion's going on. Do I? Jesus said, put the sword away. Give me a sword. I don't know. Total confusion's going on in Peter's brain. And then when you're asked this and you're not ready, you don't know what to say.
So would you really be ready to pull a gun out?
I'm sure most, in just reading this and not taking the time to contemplate, like what we're wanting to do, there'd be a lot of animosity, there'd be a lot of disappointment. I mean, even, okay, here's just a few moments ago, and the roles are reversed. You have Peter standing on the side of Christ, then Judas shows up. You traitor. There's anger. I'm sure that a lot of people read this and they'd be angry with Peter. You know, how could you? Type of situation. But with everything that Jordan brought up, there ought to be some sympathy. And to a large degree, empathy on our part. Your whole entire world is being turned upside down at this point. And when we're looking at Peter throughout this situation, and as we're moving into this next section, we can all relate with Peter in some way. Whether it be, with his impulsiveness, his, bad habit of speaking when he should be listening, and now just all of this confusion. The Lord has already said that he's going to die. Now Jesus is in their hands. Peter knows that they despise and they hate him. What are we supposed to do here?
He's helpless.
Huh?
He's helpless.
He is helpless. And it's just, all right, here is a scenario, here's a situation that they've never been in before. But he's still following. He's still trying to find a way to get in so that he can at least be there. And so that says a lot about Peter's character even in the midst of this situation. And that he has a love and a devotion that would not let Peter desert Jesus. And even in the midst of denying him, and denying him 3 times, even after Peter does that, he still does not desert Jesus. And that he's able and willing to grow from the situation. And then verse 19 is conversation between the high priest and Jesus, but we'll have to pick up on that next time, and we'll have more to say about Peter and his situation of denying, and points where we're going to make some personal application as we move forward in that. But any other thoughts or questions up to verse 18?
You need to speak louder.
Yes, you do.
Concerning the other disciple, I feel like if it was John, since we know he likes to call people out, he would have given more indication that it was him.
How does John normally describe himself?
The one that Jesus
The
loved.
one that Jesus loved.
The one who Jesus loved through the high priest.
Yeah. So, good point.
I'm thinking it was the rooster. That was the other disciple.
All right. Then we'll stop there. And there's no hot